So next up is Derek, a former colleague of mine. Derek, please join me here. All right, Derek. Looking good, man. You've lost some weight.
Sure.
You'll take it.
I'm trying to keep up. We don't all get to pump weights in the middle of meetings, you know.
Wow. Yeah. Spending time on Twitter, I see. Okay. Well, you got the slides up, so here we go.
Okay. Well, I am here to, I'm definitely here. I know it's late. It's been a great day of talks. I'm here to be the caffeine that we want in this. I will warn you that I speak quickly when I get excited, and I am excited. Okay. So we're going to talk about really how to rescue content research from the same sad metrics that right now are the ones that we all use, but hopefully very soon are going to be the ones that we can say that everybody else uses because we no longer use them. All right, so we're going to cover 4 things. The first we're going to make sure we talk about is, first of all, like we got to understand why it is that it's just not working really quickly. And then we're going to talk about improving the quantitative data that we use to do our content research, to choose the topics that we're going to produce content on. And then we're going to talk about how to use that better quantitative data set to improve and develop some qualitative data, which is where we're really going to pull the insights out. And then we're going to put it all together. So let's first talk about why it ain't working. And one thing I want to talk about right up front is to remember that tools are not solving for us. They're solving for tools, whether that's Ahrefs or Moz or BuzzSumo, whoever it is, they're solving for themselves, which doesn't always benefit us. They're pulling the metrics, right, that they can gather at scale. They're pulling mostly links and shares to figure out what kind of content to produce, not because that's the absolute best stuff that we can use to produce content, but because those are the metrics that they know they can gather across the internet really quickly. And the other thing that they're doing is they're pulling data that's easy for people to understand. Because one thing that we know is that there are ways to take some of these baseline metrics and manipulate them so that we're not just talking about raw numbers, but that's going to create friction for them as a product. So what they're ultimately doing is they're choosing the stuff that's easy for them to get, and then they're just throwing raw numbers at us. This is solving for them, but it's really not solving for us. And so I'm going to pick on somebody a bit. This is BuzzSumo, not because it's BuzzSumo, right? This is what all the content tools are telling us, but they just happened to publish a report last week. So I've decided to pick on them a little bit. Apologies if anybody from BuzzSumo is on the call. I love you very much. But here's what they're reporting to us. They're telling us that the most important stuff, the stuff that we should really be paying attention to when we're doing our content research, is the most linked content, the content that gets the top most number of social shares, and the content that really performs the best in search. Now that sounds great, but in reality, when we kind of look at what actually happens, is we end up spending a lot of time looking at content that comes from sites that already had a ton of links before they published that content that came from sites that already had a really big social following, and content from sites that have a strategy that's really focused on keyword targeted stuff. And we're supposed to believe that all the absolute top stuff is at the intersection of those places. But in reality, what this tends to surface is it tends to surface the content that lives on really big, really popular websites. And yes, there's absolutely a chance that that is some of the best stuff that's out there, but it's a confounding variable because we just don't know. And what BuzzSumo walks through in this report that they pushed out and their example that they use, it really kind of highlights that. So in their report, they were looking at the topic of content strategy, and they were trying to say, okay, what's the best content out there on content strategy? Inception-y, I know. And to pick on somebody, to add in somebody else in this folder here, I'll take the export of the top stuff on content strategy from Ahrefs. And this is the top content from their Content Explorer. And one thing you might notice is the average domain authority of the stuff that's up there is 90, right? So we're talking about the top tiny fraction of websites on the planet Earth. So either it's a coincidence that the biggest, most powerful websites are the only ones publishing really interesting stuff, or we've got data that's coming from these tools that's really biasing us toward a specific subset of websites. So when we look at what BuzzSumo shows us, it's another example of kind of some of the limitations of this baseline quantitative data, right? The very top piece of content on content strategy comes from Gary Vee. It might be great. Dude also has 2.2 million followers on Twitter, right? So we have no idea whether in the last 2 years he has published, in fact, the very best thing out there, or whether it just so happens that he published something and because he's Gary Vee, it got tons of traction. And even if we look a little bit more closely at some of this quantitative data, we start to see some of the things that are kind of weird about it, right? Like, how did this get 9,000 engagements on Facebook, but only 1 on Twitter? Or you look at the thing that's second in one of these tools, it got all of its shares on Pinterest. Maybe I'll admit I've totally possibly missed the boat, but I don't get much content strategy information from Pinterest, right? So we know that we're having trouble here when we take these raw exports. If we just exported this and started saying, okay, I'm going to go choose what I'm going to do on content research based on what this tool shows me, I'm really not getting much insight at all. And in BuzzSumo's report, the sort of like their outcomes of this, what would they say we should be focusing on as a result, is the sort of skyscraper forever kind of technique, right? They're saying, choose a unique format. Maybe that's possible. It depends on how popular it's done. It might have been done a million different ways all the time. Make it better designed. Okay, well, if you're going against the popular topic and it's, a lot of big sites competing, it's already gonna be pretty well designed. Make it longer. This is like the please God, no more ultimate guides. I've seen enough. Like this is definitely not going to be the solution forever to keep making things longer. Make it more up to date. Well, if I'm just planning some content now and I'm about to publish it, it's going to be as up to date as it can possibly be. Decide on your angle. Okay, this one is actually pretty interesting. This is what we're going to come back to. Personalize and scale your outreach. Okay, if you've been on the receiving end of outreach, you'll realize that nobody's really doing this well, and it's mostly just pain and suffering for your inbox. And the last one is to prioritize relationship building with authoritative contacts, which is absolutely wonderful advice, but it is not a bullet point that should live alongside, make it a little more, make it a little longer, and make it more up to date, right? This is like a years-long effort. So what we're really left with, the sort of most instructive thing that comes out of this is to decide on an angle. And the reality is that quantitative data is not going to give us the information that we need to really figure out the angle that's going to work. So the truth, the thing that we have to accept here is that quantitative data is not coming to our rescue, right? We are not about to get a tool, BuzzSumo, Ahrefs, Moz, any of these that's going to report to us, oh, hey, this content generated this number of leads, they were worth this amount of money, right? It is not on the way. Help is not coming. So we have to accept two things. One, we have to accept it's not coming. And two, we have to say, okay, can we make this quantitative data a little bit better so that we can do some real qualitative research on that data set that's actually going to give us the information that we need to really decide on an angle and publish something that's really going to get traction. So let's talk about a couple of ways that we can improve the quantitative data that we do have. And there are two things we can answer that we can kind of try to solve for that come up when we look at some of those reports that you see from a tool like BuzzSumo. And the first one is we want to know, were these results a big deal for the site, right? If we're taking Gary Vee's thing that he published on content strategy, is 9,000 engagements on Facebook for him, is that normal? Or is that like way above normal? Is that way below normal? We really don't have any idea. And secondly, the other thing we want to account for, especially when we're talking about links, are we talking about links that really had a wow factor, or are we talking about these passive links? And by passive links, I mean, you cover a topic that has really high search volume, you publish it, it sits at the top of search results, and inevitably other people are writing about that. They go grab, whatever things you've cited in your initial article, and you gain links. It's a great strategy if you want to earn links. But what it does is it creates a lot of noise in our quantitative data because we have no idea, hey, if this thing earned 1,000 links, did it really blow people away? Or is it just kind of like mediocre, but it sits on a big website and therefore it earns tons of links that way? And these are little bits of context that we can add to our data. Now, especially in the B2B space, one of the things that you learn painfully and quickly is that our B2B competitive set is usually pretty lame. So if I'm going to start out some research and figure out, I want to go find the most linked content on X, Y, or Z, looking at our immediate competitors rarely provides us with much insight. And that's often because they're not doing much content marketing, or they're not doing very good content marketing. And so what we're going to walk through here, the example that we're going to carry through here through the rest of this, is looking at a topic, expense management, business expense management. This is something we were working on really, really recently for a client. And when you think of expense management, this can be anything from sort of some of the broader accounting aspects that go into business to the more specific, like using an expense card when you take a client out or you're on a business trip, that kind of thing. And when we started digging into this, the first thing we saw was that very much indeed the competitive set was lame. So I pulled this as a direct screenshot from a doc where I was looking at some of the competitors, and it's like, this is a tiny little side business for Visa and MasterCard. They didn't care about it, so they had nothing. A couple other small competitors, literally nothing of note, nothing that earned more than 1 or 2 shares or links. The best outcome here was a small and sad content marketing effort. So there's nothing here to look at from a competitive set perspective. And so that leads us back to saying, okay, we're going to start with a kind of keyword topic-based strategy. And the only reason I really bring that up now is because that kind of affects the types of analyses and the way that we can manipulate the quantitative data. So these are some strategies to use when you're starting at that standpoint. Okay, I know the topic I want to look at. I'm not caring about a specific subset of websites that I might consider competitors. And as a starting point for this kind of research, it's totally okay to start with an export from one of these content explorer tools. That will be the baseline for most of us for the quantitative data that we pull. What we're trying to do is to try to improve and clean up that data so we can do some real analysis that's going to provide a lot of insight for us. Because what happens is, this is this is the top content for the term business expenses or expense management from Ahrefs. When we pull this out, we put it in a spreadsheet. What you're really going to quickly notice is if we sort this by the most, highest links to most links to fewest links, it is not a very interesting list. This is basically a bunch of Wikipedia links, a bunch of IRS links. There's nothing in here that's going to give me the really unique, wonderful insights that I need to do something original. And so what you end up doing, if you're, me historically, or probably a lot of us, right? You just kind of start scrolling through this list, looking at some random topics, thinking, oh, maybe, I don't know. And you just keep going until maybe you feel like you might have found something. And that's kind of where we've been left. But we can take this same data set. This can be the same data set that we're going to walk through the rest of this presentation. And with just a little bit of manipulation, can get so much more value out of it. And so we're going to add some contextual metrics to do this. And so the first thing we're going to do is, if you go back into Screaming Frog, and you take this list of URLs that you have exported from Ahrefs, you can plug in the Ahrefs API, and we can pull 2 additional metrics that are going to be really helpful for us. The first one of those that we're going to pull is the number of referring domains, or the number of links to go to the top level domain of the website. So all the links going to the website. And the second one that we're going to pull is the number of referring domains that go to the homepage of each website. And I'll explain why we're pulling those 2 metrics in a second, but it's a really simple extraction, plugs right in with Screaming Frog. You can use some other tools as well if you don't have Ahrefs. Really easy to do. Now, once we have that data, we can start doing some really simple but interesting calculations. So if I take the number of referring domains to the entire website, and I subtract the number of referring domains to the homepage, what I end up with is the number of referring domains to pages other than the homepage. And this is a really quick, down and dirty way to kind of clean up the data, because what we're going to want to see is, based on the number of links that an individual article earned, do we think that was a big deal for a website? Because for a lot of websites, they might have 70, 80, 90% of the total links going to the homepage. Ripping out those homepage links right away leaves us with that remainder of links that were generated mostly probably by content. Certainly other pages as well, but it's just a way to clean up that data a little bit. Is it imperfect? Absolutely. Does it improve our quantitative data set? Also, absolutely. So again, that's just a simple column in Excel to improve that a little bit, get that extra data point that we have now of the number of non-homepage referring domains. Now, if we take that, and again, really simple formula here, I'll walk you through it. Referring domains, the number of links to an individual article over the number of non-homepage referring domains times 100 is going to give us the percentage of non-homepage referring domains that an individual article accounts for. And what that's going to tell us is, it's going to say, hey, this article right here, this might have accounted for 20% of the total links to that website. That's a really good indicator for me off the bat that, hey, regardless of what the absolute performance was as far as number of links, I know that this single article was probably an overperformer and a really important article for this website. Now, at the same time, we can pull 1 extra data point, and all this data is actually already in the Ahrefs export. So you don't have to add any other data. All you're literally going to add here is a column to a spreadsheet and some simple division. And the logic here is we're going to try to find out, try to parse, okay, did this individual article earn a bunch of links because it ranks for something or not? And the logic is that if we divide the number of referring domains to an article over the traffic, and that traffic metric is something that Ahrefs will estimates and exports with you, you can get the number of referring domains per organic visit. And so the logic is that if something gets 100 referring domains for every 1 organic visitor, we know there's a super good chance that it's earning links some way totally unrelated to how it's performing in organic search. At the same time, if it's only earning 1 link for every 1,000 organic visitors or 10,000 organic visitors that it gets, there's a good chance that it's sitting at the top of some search result somewhere and earning those passive links that we've talked about. So again, really quickly, and I can resort my sheet, and all of a sudden, I'm starting to get a little bit better data. You look at those content titles, all of a sudden, it's not just Wikipedia. It's not just IRS stuff. We're starting to get real articles that can be informative of the strategy we want to build. And so I want to be really clear here that even when you look at this data after you do this, for whatever topic that you work on, it is absolutely still going to be noisy, imperfect data. All right, but we know that quantitative data for our strategy here is not going to have the answers. It's never going to have the answers that we want. But what we know is that if we can improve that quantitative data, if we can get better quantitative data, then it's going to make it much, much easier for us to find the answers that we want during a qualitative analysis. Okay, so we have our list now, right? We have our spreadsheet. It has a few extra columns. We can sort in a few different ways. Now is really a kind of a fun part to play around with the data set that we have until it starts looking like something where we could do some interesting qualitative research. So right away, this is kind of a baseline of what your spreadsheet might look like. And what you can see in the far right column here is I've sorted this to look at the percentage of referring domains to non-home pages, right? So this is basically saying, does this one article account for most or a big chunk of links to this site? And what you can also add, because this is a relative metric, right? We can also add an absolute metric that's going to be a baseline by looking at the number of referring domains to an individual article. And the point of this is that very easily an article could be 50% of all the referring domains to a website if that article has 3 links and the entire site has 6. And we don't really care about that stuff. So you can filter your spreadsheet here to create a baseline. I've chosen a kind of arbitrary baseline of 20 referring domains, saying I only really care about stuff that's earned at least 20 referring domains, but that's entirely up to you and whatever's going to make sense as you go along. But all of a sudden, what I'm starting to see as I'm playing around with the spreadsheet is that list of titles over on the content side is getting better and better and better, and I'm starting to see some really interesting stuff. Now, I can do the same thing if I, once I start to get these interesting things, I can add a column and simply start tagging stuff if I think it's interesting as yes. And the reason that I'm doing this is I know that there's still going to be noise in this data, right? This is still going to be data that's imperfect. That's going to have some stuff that from a quantitative baseline, it connects the dots, but it's not helping me out from a qualitative perspective. And so as I go, I look and I start to see, hey, there are some interesting things in here, right? Okay, we have DoorDash with 1099 taxes and write-offs. All of a sudden I'm thinking, okay, like gig economy stuff and how that might be impacted when we come to expense management. Or we have, what happens if people are getting paid with like crypto or Bitcoin? Like how does that fit into, how do you manage expenses of that? Or some more traditional stuff like, okay, tax deductions at an industry specific level for a real estate agent. So I'm starting to find some stuff that's interesting. And at this point, I'm still not trying to say, okay, based on the data, what do I want to write about? All I'm trying to do is say, okay, I've established this quantitative baseline that's starting to give me stuff that looks more interesting. And I'm going through and I'm tagging stuff with yes, I think is kind of interesting, kind of related that I want to come back to later. And we can do this exact same thing when we resort for traffic. So here I have this spreadsheet resorted again for referring domains per organic visitor, right? So that's the baseline sort. I'm looking at stuff that I think earned a lot of links without necessarily having any kind of presence in search to help with that. I still have my baseline of where I've filtered here for at least 20 referring domains. And then I can also use that original data point that I had too with the percentage of referring domains to non-home pages to say, hey, let's put this at least a minimum of 2%. So I'm saying three things here, right? I want to look at stuff that's earning links despite the fact that it's probably not ranking for a whole lot. I want to look at stuff that's a minimum baseline of at least 20 links. And I want to look at stuff that accounts for at least 2% of the total links to that site. You can absolutely play around with this. And the goal is to keep playing around until when you look at that list of content titles, it starts seeming like, okay, a lot of these things are things that seem pretty relevant to a strategy that I might want to create. At that point, again, you're going to go in, you have your column of interesting. You're going to start just going through and tagging stuff as yes. It's going to be noisy data. They're going to be irrelevant ones. But you're also going to start to see some things that really make sense. Like we see some things here that relate to COVID and how COVID has changed business and how that might affect how people are or aren't able to expense things, or if different loan programs have restrictions on them, right? So I'm just tagging stuff that's interesting. And the outcome of all this is that instead of starting from that sheet that all I had was, a bunch of stuff that was really highly linked and a lot of it was super irrelevant, I've now established that all the articles in here qualify in two ways. One, they qualify where they've hit those baseline quantitative metrics where I've said, okay, based on how much value quantitative data can provide me, I know that these things are things that have earned a decent number of links in ways that probably impressed people and that account for sort of an above average performance on a website. And at this point, I'm sort of going to unhitch the quantitative data from the train because it's done what it could for me, right? It's time to let that go. And I've filtered it now also with those yeses to stuff that I think is relevant. And all of a sudden I have a really, really good data set to start to dig into to really start to build a strategy. Now, if all we cared about were just links, we could stop right here and we could say, I'm just going to look at this content based on links. But it's always great if you can add in another data set because we know that links are kind of a myopic way to look at this stuff. And so Hacker News, when it comes to B2B, is absolutely one of my favorite data sets to look into. And that's for a couple reasons. One of those is they just do a lot of the work for you already. When I drop expense management into their search, it's going to pull up the most popular content from all time because it's set up like a Reddit upvoting system. It automatically surfaces stuff. So I'm starting to see stuff like WeWork will no longer let employees expense any kind of meat. Really interesting topic that gets there right away. I don't have to do any work. I don't have to add any columns. It's all there for me. And on top of that, because it has comments that are also upvoted, I get that much better understanding of why this stuff resonated with people. If I'm just looking at this as a headline, I might be thinking, okay, WeWork, it's a popular company. That's probably going to drive some interest. Talking about vegetarianism, is it right or is it wrong, right? There's people going to have opinions about that. But what you also see when you dig into the comments is people saying things like, I can't eat a lot of types of food due to allergies. Meat is one of the few things I can still eat without issue. So all of a sudden, a really interesting idea here of, hey, look, this is creating this gap between management's making these decisions and employees on the ground are having issues that management probably never thought about when they made these decisions. Or you look at a really contemporary one, like Google tells employees they can't expense food when working from home, right? Obviously, there's something very recent changes that affected things. Me looking at this, I'm just thinking, okay, it's a trend. What's the big deal? You look at the comments and somebody says, oh, actually, the IRS has been coming after these big tech companies for a while. and arguing that some of this free food that they get there is income. So again, really fascinating topic when we talk about business expenses. Should it count as income? Who's benefiting? Who's struggling? What's the result of remote work? So many interesting topics that come out of this information. And then the tyranny of silly expense control rules. There's sort of a typical, the expectation of like, okay, people are going to get, annoyed about what they can or can't expense. But again, somebody's dropped in here, oh, did you know that the BBC, when they said internal meetings could no longer have free biscuits, saved 200,000 pounds? So this is just one, hilarious, but two, also fascinating, right? Because we could say, okay, I wonder if other public agencies, US government agencies, maybe they have to report this stuff too. Right? Maybe they have to report what they're spending money on. Maybe these really interesting stories of scale where these decisions that you think, if you're an employee, it makes no sense, like they've just stolen this one great thing from you, is actually saving them 200,000 pounds a year, like really, really fascinating stuff. And so you can take some of these titles, you can take comment snippets, and you can drop them into that same spreadsheet where you have the articles that earn the links. And you can think of that as this single sheet that sort of has all the answers to a single open-ended question. Right? And so we have the list of the content that's tagged yes, and we have that list of links and comment snippets from Hacker News, or it could be Reddit, or it could be any other number of sources that you like. And now is the really fun part, because to be honest, when we put it all together, if you're not excited at this point, if you're not having fun right now, you're absolutely in the wrong profession. And the great news about all this is that what we know is that these quantitative research tools, they're not coming for our jobs right now. This is creative work that's based on a foundation of good quantitative data, but it is up to us to use our brains to figure out what are the themes that really resonate with people and how can we apply those to a strategy. And when we get to these last two steps here, this first one of coding your data into themes, one of the things I want to reiterate that's really, really important is don't over focus on which one of these themes is particularly relevant or try to shoehorn it into what kind of content you think you can create. We're still not thinking yet about what I want to produce based on what's popular. What you want to do is create this reservoir that you can come back to again and again of really, really good qualitative data of the things that really got people excited based on some quantitative baselines. And so we did this, we came up with some themes like, okay, how has COVID impacted the business expense management, the landscape? We know there's new legislation, things like the PPP loans. More interestingly, probably, is the transition to remote work and how that's going to have short-term and long-term effects on expense management. Where do you draw the line in employee misuse? There's sort of these epic stories that you find. There was some CEO that tried to expense $76,000 to a strip club, right? So if you're kind of like on the BuzzFeedy side of things, you can see where that might be something where you could just catalog a few narratives and get a lot of traction. But there's also this more interesting question of, expense management becoming this space where corporations become the nanny state, right? Where they're saying what is or isn't right for you to buy, what is morally correct or incorrect for you to expense. And then there's also this kind of the appropriate role in general for companies. So there's software out there that can make expense management easier where you don't have to deal with like turning in paper receipts, but it often also means that you have an app on your phone that everything you're spending money on your corporate card is, getting pushed immediately into an app. And so maybe there's some privacy issues. Like maybe if it were still on paper, you wouldn't ask for reimbursement for all those things. And then also this issue of these small regulatory changes that can really have an outsized impact. So this is the reservoir that we can then pull from to say, okay, there are a million different ways that we can take this, either from a topic perspective and or a tone perspective, to create really interesting content. So some of the places we land, where can we tell a part of this story? So how has COVID impacted business expense management? Well, we can say there are 3 things that business expenses that COVID has changed for now, and 5 it probably changed forever. Like that's a simple listicle. But if you were, a big fancy organization and had to do something more stoic, you could also say, okay, how has COVID changed the regulatory landscape for a bit? Like you can do, if you have that good reservoir, there's so many different ways you can do it. You don't have to worry about it. You're going to find the way to fit your tone into these themes if you start with really good themes. Where do you draw the line in employee misuse? This was probably my favorite one that we found when we dug into this stuff, was how to communicate changes to expense management, right? Because it was a chance to talk directly to the stakeholder who's purchasing this stuff, who in general, from what we saw in this qualitative analysis, was super unaware about how some of the changes that they were proposing were going to affect employees, or how employees were going to interpret those changes. So this is a great opportunity to create content really specifically for that stakeholder. So you're getting in front of the person that you want to buy your product. And at the same time, it's something that not many people are talking about on their side of things, but very much the employees that are on the receiving end of these changes are talking about. And then what's the appropriate role for companies? You can also spin this stuff to get a little bit closer to your product, right? So expenses your company's app can't track for you. One of the things we saw somebody complaining about was the fact that, hey, I have this MTA card that I use for, the subways and whatnot. That's really difficult to integrate with the system that we have. So if you have a new system that you've developed that does integrate with that stuff, here's a chance for you to talk about where your product is solving those problems, still based on those themes that people found were super, super interesting. So what did we just talk about? A lot of stuff. Quantitative data, for one, it's never going to be enough. Don't try to make quantitative data the solution that it cannot be, right? The raw numbers of links and shares are pretty useless for us. No tool is ever going to give us what we need to do quantitative only strategies. Second, that little bit of context, even though the quantitative data isn't perfect, that little bit of context can really improve the quantitative data that we have, right? We can control for what's usual for a site in terms of a number of links, whether those links came from search. We can also filter those results sort of ad nauseum to play around until we feel like we're looking at a really good set of data that we then want to do some qualitative analysis on. And the best part to me is that we get to use our brains. We get to do really fun stuff once we have that underlying support of that quantitative data set. So we can code that clean data into themes, and then we can find where to connect these popular themes to what makes the most sense for you or your company.
Boom. All right. Questions. Let's start with, I saw one question was posted in the chat as well. Hey, Derek, what about the do follow or no follow links that affect the referring domains? Any thought on that?
Sure. I mean, that would be another way that you could filter it. I mean, I think, search engines are looking to some degree, what they say versus what they do is maybe a little bit different as far as whether they give weight to those do follow versus no follow. I think from the perspective of seeing whether or not people care about it, there are a lot of big popular sites that straight up don't give out no follow links. Or they only give out no follow links. So I think it makes sense to include those. It's with the quantitative data, the rabbit hole that we can go down is we can always sort of obsess over cleaning this data that, to be honest, was never that great to begin with. That's why, I don't really care what tool you use to pull this stuff. You're trying to get that baseline of things that's going to ultimately, in aggregate, give you some themes that you can work with. If you're missing out on a single article or the data is a little bit off, it was, I promise you, already off to begin with. It's probably not going to affect you in the long run.
Cool. Is there any merit to starting with the qualitative, interesting themes first and then corroborate with the data?
You could try. I don't know if I'm that smart to figure out what those themes are. I like it in the way that content is often so open-ended. Like, if like business expenses, like you can imagine the billion different things, or, CXL can do anything they want on marketing. It's almost helpful to have that quantitative data initially just to sort of focus what you're doing, so that it's almost more of a burden not to have it as a starting point. And then I think also, if you're coming at it from a client services perspective and you're presenting something, it certainly helps if you can say, hey, these are the ideas that we had based on this data, versus saying we came up with some ideas and then we tried to cherry pick some data to help support those.
Do you have to use Screaming Frog, or can you do it all with Ahrefs?
You can do some of it. It's tedious in some ways to do within the Ahrefs UI, especially when you're looking at pulling, for example, the number of referring domains, the top level domain for each individual URL. So you can use other tools other than Screaming Frog, probably. I just know that it's a really easy connection. I mean, Screaming Frog lets you crawl. I think it may not let you do API integrations unless you pay for it, but it's like $200 for a year. I mean, odds are the amount of time that you would spend even manually looking up a few things, just pay for it. It pays for itself. It's a great tool.
So you use implicit, tacit knowledge of the topic to decide what's interesting versus not interesting, or do you run it by someone? How do you refine your intuition?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think obviously there could be benefits to cross-checking some of these broad themes. And then what I've done, and I've done this for kind of several clients before, and there are times where I'll sort of present them with some of those initial themes and say, hey, what do you think about these themes? What do any of these sort of like resonate more with you than others? At the same time, I do think for most of us in content, you have to be a good generalist, and you have to trust that you're able to look through a data set and pick out what's important and valuable. And that's a useful skill for one. And then also, we certainly know that all of us in our own companies are usually pretty bad at assessing our own markets, and we all have pretty strong biases and blinders when it comes to that. So to be honest, I think the benefit of fresh eyes probably in a lot of cases, unless it's something super technical, probably outweighs the benefit of, not to say you can't get an expert opinion if you really feel lost, but it's nice to have fresh eyes, and clients, in my experience, have appreciated it too.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Derek.